The silent assignment. Staff Sergeant James Caldwell had stopped feeling his fingers somewhere around the ninth hour. The cold had worked its way through his gloves, through the wool liner beneath, through skin and tendon until his hands felt like they belonged to someone else. He lay perfectly still on the second floor of what had once been a Belgian farmhouse, now little more than a skeleton of blackened beams and shattered stone. The roof was gone. Snow had drifted through the gaps in the walls and settled in the corners where firelight had once warmed a family that was no longer here. Through the splintered window frame to his front, Caldwell watched the tree line 400 yards distant, a dark smudge against the gray December sky. Somewhere beyond those trees, the German army was moving. That was why he was here. That was why he had been lying motionless since dawn, his Springfield rifle resting on a folded sandbag, his breathing shallow and controlled. Beside him, 3 feet to his right, Private Eddie Klein lay in the same position, his face wrapped in a scarf, only his eyes visible. Klein was 19. Caldwell was 26, though the war had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with years. He had grown up on a ranch outside Billings, Montana, where patience was a survival skill. You learned to wait. You learned to watch. You learned that rushing meant failure, whether you were tracking elk through snow or trying to fix a fence line in wind that could strip skin. The Army had recognized something in him during training at Camp Ritchie, something that made him suitable for this kind of work. It was not aggression. It was the opposite. It was the ability to remain still when every instinct screamed to move. The mission was simple in theory. Intelligence had identified this sector, just outside Schnee-Eifel, near the German border, as a potential supply route. The German counteroffensive had begun 6 days earlier, smashing through the Ardennes with a ferocity that had caught the Allied command off guard. Entire divisions had been encircled. Communication lines had been severed. The front had dissolved into pockets of confusion, isolated units fighting without clear orders or support. Caldwell's regiment, part of the 2nd Infantry Division, had been pulled into the chaos, tasked with holding a series of ridgelines and villages that suddenly mattered far more than anyone had anticipated. His specific assignment was reconnaissance. Observe, record, report. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary. His presence here was not about killing. It was about information. Command needed to know where the Germans were moving, in what strength, and toward which objectives. A sniper in the right position could provide that information without firing a shot. So Caldwell watched. He noted the time when he heard engines in the distance. He noted the direction of movement, when voices drifted through the fog. He noted the placement of sentries, the rhythm of patrols, the gaps in coverage. Klein kept a small notebook tucked inside his jacket, jotting down details in pencil when Caldwell signaled. The cold made writing difficult. Klein's handwriting had devolved into cramped, barely legible scrawls, but it would be enough. The day passed in increments of discomfort. Hunger was manageable. Thirst was worse. Caldwell had a canteen, but drinking meant moving, and moving meant risk. He had learned to ration not just water, but motion itself. Every shift of weight, every adjustment of position, had to be calculated and slow. The body wanted to fidget, to stretch, to relieve the pressure building in joints and muscles. Discipline meant denying those wants. Around midday, a German patrol had passed within 200 yards of the farmhouse, 6 men moving in a loose column through the snow. Caldwell had watched them through his scope, studying their equipment, their pace, their bearing. They looked tired. One of them limped. They did not look toward the farmhouse. By the time dusk arrived, Caldwell had been in position for 11 hours. The temperature had dropped further. The light bled out of the sky in shades of gray and pale violet, and the world became a study in shadows. Artillery rumbled somewhere to the south, a low and constant thunder that never quite stopped. Klein shifted slightly, his breath misting in the freezing air. Caldwell glanced at him. Klein's eyes were alert, scanning the room behind them, the staircase, the doorway. Then Klein leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. "I heard something." Caldwell did not move. He waited. Klein's gaze flicked toward the doorway that led to the adjacent room. Could be wind, Klein murmured. Could be debris. Caldwell listened. The farmhouse creaked and settled around them, the way old buildings do in cold weather. But beneath that, faint and irregular, there was something else. A sound that might have been nothing, or might have been everything. The weight of stillness. Night came down like a curtain. The last trace of daylight disappeared, and the farmhouse became a place of absolute shadow. Caldwell's eyes adjusted slowly, picking out the shapes of broken furniture, the jagged outline of the window frame, the darker mass of Klein's body beside him. The cold intensified. It was the kind of cold that made breathing painful, that turned moisture in the nostrils to ice, that crept into the chest and made the heart work harder just to maintain warmth. Caldwell's body wanted to shiver. He would not let it. Shivering meant movement, and movement meant noise, and noise meant compromise. He focused on his breathing, slowing it, deepening it, letting the oxygen feed his muscles without the telltale vapor cloud that came from rapid exhalation. Klein was doing the same. They had practiced this, they had trained for it. But training in a controlled environment was different from lying in a frozen ruin with the enemy nearby and no clear extraction plan. The sound Klein had heard did not repeat. An hour passed, then another. Time became elastic in the dark, stretching and compressing without reference. Caldwell's thoughts drifted to his training at Camp Ritchie, where instructors had drilled into them the core truth of sniper doctrine. Patience was the weapon. Marksmanship mattered, but only after patience had created the opportunity. A sniper who could not wait was just a rifleman in the wrong position. The instructors had made them lie in fields for days, observing targets that never appeared, enduring heat and insects and boredom until the discomfort became background noise. Caldwell had excelled at that. He understood waiting. He understood that the mind would try to create urgency where none existed, that the body would manufacture reasons to move. The key was recognizing those impulses and dismissing them. Around 0200 hours, Caldwell heard voices. They were distant, perhaps 300 yards to the southeast, moving through the trees along the suspected route. German voices, low and conversational, accompanied by the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Caldwell did not reach for his scope. The night was too dark for visual confirmation, and the sound alone told him what he needed to know. The Germans were using the route. They were moving south, likely resupplying forward positions or rotating units. He made a mental note of the time, the direction, the approximate number of voices. Klein heard them too. His breathing remained steady, controlled. The voices faded after several minutes, swallowed by distance and the muffling effect of snow-covered trees. Silence returned, but it was not empty. There was always sound if you listened closely enough, the wind moving through gaps in the walls, the faint creak of timber contracting in the cold, the distant artillery never quite stopping, a reminder that the war continued whether or not you could see it. Caldwell's leg had gone numb. It was his left leg, the one bearing most of his weight as he lay prone. The numbness started as tingling, then progressed to a dull ache, and finally to nothing at all. He knew the leg was still there, but he could not feel it. This was dangerous. If he needed to move quickly, the leg might not respond, but shifting position now in the dark, with unknown threats nearby, was more dangerous. So he stayed still. Around 0400, Klein made a small gesture with his hand, a signal they had developed. He needed to move. His leg, like Caldwell's, had gone numb. Caldwell shook his head slowly, a barely perceptible motion. Klein's jaw tightened, but he did not move. The discipline held. Minutes passed. The numbness in Caldwell's leg deepened. He focused on his breathing, on the rhythm of inhale and exhale, using it to anchor his awareness and distract from the discomfort. Pain was information. It told you that you were still alive, still functional. You acknowledged it and moved on. The first gray light of dawn began to seep into the farmhouse around 0530. It was not true light, just a gradual lessening of absolute darkness, enough to pick out shapes and edges. Caldwell could see Klein more clearly now, could see the frost on his scarf, the tension in his shoulders. He could see the doorway, the staircase beyond, the debris scattered across the floor. And then he heard it. Both of them heard it. Footsteps inside the farmhouse, on the lower floor. Caldwell's hand tightened on his rifle. The footsteps moved through the room below, paused, then continued. They were not random. They were searching. Someone was in the building with them, and whoever it was, they were being careful. The unseen presence. Caldwell's mind moved through the variables with cold precision. The footsteps below were methodical, the kind of movement that suggested reconnaissance rather than casual exploration. Someone was checking the farmhouse, room by room, either looking for threats or confirming the building was empty. The cadence of the steps indicated one person, not a group. That was both a relief and a complication. One person could be managed, but one person alone suggested competence and caution. The German army did not send careless soldiers into forward areas. Caldwell shifted his gaze to Klein without moving his head. Klein was staring at the doorway, his body rigid, his breathing shallow. Caldwell made a slow, deliberate hand gesture. Stay still. No sound. Klein nodded fractionally. The footsteps moved again, this time closer to the base of the staircase. Caldwell's rifle was angled toward the doorway, but his finger remained off the trigger. Firing now would accomplish nothing except compromise. The sound would carry, alerting every German unit within a half-mile. Their mission would end, and their chances of survival would plummet. But if the person below came upstairs, if they entered this room, the situation would force a decision. Caldwell ran through scenarios. If confronted, he could attempt to take the soldier quietly, but close-quarters combat was unpredictable and loud. If the soldier saw them and retreated, they would be compromised. If the soldier was merely passing through, unaware of their presence, the best option was to remain invisible. Everything depended on the next 60 seconds. The footsteps stopped directly below their position. Caldwell could hear the faint sound of breathing, the rustle of fabric. Whoever was down there was standing still, listening, perhaps sensing something wrong. Minutes passed in that frozen state. Caldwell's heart beat steadily in his chest, audible to him but no one else. He controlled it through breathing, through focus, through the mental discipline that had been drilled into him. Then a board creaked. It was not loud, but in the silence it was unmistakable. Klein's elbow had shifted slightly, pressing against a loose floorboard beneath the debris. The creak echoed through the empty farmhouse. Caldwell did not react. Klein froze completely, his eyes wide. Below them, the footsteps resumed, faster now, moving toward the staircase. Caldwell's finger moved to the trigger guard. The stairs were old wood, and they announced every step. Caldwell counted them. 1, 2, 3. The person climbing was taking their time, pausing between steps, listening. 4, 5, 6. At the top of the stairs, the footsteps stopped again. Caldwell could see a shadow now, cast by the dim morning light filtering through the lower windows. The shadow shifted. Then a raven landed on the windowsill to Caldwell's left. It cawed once, loud and sharp, and the sound shattered the silence like glass. Caldwell did not flinch. The raven cawed again, then took off, wings beating against the cold air. The shadow at the top of the stairs moved forward. The wind shifted. It came through the broken walls from the south, carrying with it a scent that Caldwell recognized immediately. Tobacco. Cheap, acrid tobacco, the kind the German army issued to its soldiers. The person on the stairs was close enough now that the wind carried their scent upward. Caldwell could hear the faint sound of breathing, slightly labored, suggesting exertion or cold. The footsteps moved again, no longer hesitant. They were coming toward the room. Caldwell's muscles coiled ready. His mind was clear, empty of fear, focused entirely on reaction. The doorway was 6 feet away. The German would step through, and in that instant, Caldwell would have to decide. The footsteps reached the doorway. A shape appeared, gray against the dim light. Caldwell could see the edge of a uniform, the outline of a rifle slung across a shoulder. The figure paused in the doorway, silhouetted, unmoving. Shh! Caldwell's breathing stopped. Klein was a statue beside him. The German stepped into the room. Caldwell could see him clearly now, young, maybe 20 years old, with frost clinging to the collar of his Feldgrau tunic. His face was pale, thin, marked by exhaustion and cold. He carried a Mauser 98K across his back, and his hands were bare, red from the freezing air. The soldier's eyes scanned the room slowly, adjusting to the dim interior. He was cautious, alert, but he had not yet seen them. Caldwell and Klein were partially concealed by shadow and debris, their stillness rendering them invisible in the gray half-light. The German's gaze swept past them once, then again. His posture shifted, his shoulders tensed. He unslung his rifle, holding it ready but not raised. He took another step forward, closer. Caldwell's finger rested on the trigger. Then the German did something Caldwell did not expect. He lowered his rifle, he reached for the canteen on his belt, uncapped it, and took a long drink. Huh. Then he sat down on a broken beam 6 feet from Caldwell's position, facing away toward the window. The moment of contact. The German soldier sat with his back to Caldwell, his rifle resting across his knees, his breath misting in the frozen air. Caldwell could see every detail now. The tear in the soldier's tunic sleeve, crudely stitched with dark thread. The mud caked on his boots. The way his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. He was alone, separated from his unit. And he had chosen this room to rest because it offered a vantage point toward the tree line and a moment of shelter from the wind. He had no idea that 2 American soldiers lay in the shadows behind him, close enough to touch. Caldwell's mind processed the situation with mechanical clarity. The German was vulnerable. His back was exposed. His rifle was not raised. A single shot would end him, quiet and quick. But a single shot would also announce their presence to anyone within earshot, and the farmhouse was not defensible. If the German had radioed his position, if others were nearby, the sound would bring them running. The mission required silence. It required invisibility. It required the German to leave without ever knowing they were here. Caldwell kept his rifle trained on the soldier's back, his finger resting lightly on the trigger guard, not the trigger itself. Beside him, Klein was utterly still, his eyes locked on the German, waiting for Caldwell's signal. But Caldwell gave no signal. There was nothing to do but wait. The German took another drink from his canteen, then replaced the cap with slow, deliberate movements. His hands were shaking. Whether from cold or exhaustion or fear, Caldwell could not tell. The soldier reached into his tunic and pulled out a small object, turning it over in his hands. Caldwell could not see it clearly, but the motion suggested something personal, a photograph, perhaps, or a letter. The German stared at it for a long moment, his head bowed, his breath shallow. Then he tucked it away and leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. Caldwell felt his own heartbeat slow. The German was not leaving. He was resting. Perhaps he had been awake all night. Perhaps he was lost, disoriented, trying to gather himself before moving on. Whatever his reasons, he was staying. And that meant Caldwell and Klein were trapped. Minutes passed. The gray light outside grew marginally brighter, though the day remained overcast and dim. Caldwell's leg, already numb, began to cramp. It was a deep, burning pain that radiated from his calf up through his thigh. He ignored it. Pain was irrelevant. Movement was the only thing that mattered, and movement was not an option. Klein's eyes flicked toward him, asking a silent question. Caldwell shook his head, the motion so small it was almost imperceptible. They would not move. They would not make a sound. They would wait. The German shifted slightly, leaning forward to peer out the window. He was watching the tree line, scanning for movement, just as Caldwell had been doing for the past 16 hours. For a brief, surreal moment, Caldwell felt a strange kinship with the man. They were both soldiers doing the same job, watching the same terrain, enduring the same cold. The only difference was the direction they faced and the flags they served. The German muttered something under his breath, a single word in German that Caldwell did not understand. It sounded like frustration, or maybe resignation. The soldier stood abruptly, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Caldwell's finger moved to the trigger. The German turned, facing the room, facing Caldwell's position. For a single frozen heartbeat, his eyes passed directly over the spot where Caldwell lay. Caldwell did not breathe. The German's gaze moved on, unseeing, and he walked toward the doorway. His boots echoed on the floor. He descended the stairs without looking back, each step deliberate and slow. At the bottom, he paused. Caldwell heard the scrape of a door, the creak of hinges. Then the door slammed shut, and the farmhouse was silent once more. The longest morning, Caldwell did not move. Not yet. The German had left, but that did not mean he was gone. He could be standing outside the door listening. He could be circling the building, checking the perimeter. He could have heard something, sensed something, and decided to investigate from a different angle. Caldwell kept his rifle trained on the doorway, his breathing controlled, his body still. Beside him, Klein remained frozen, his eyes wide, his jaw clenched. They waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the distant rumble of artillery. Caldwell's mind replayed the moment when the German's eyes had passed over him. Had he been seen? Had the soldier recognized the shape of the man in the shadows and chosen not to react? Or had he simply failed to notice, his exhaustion and focus on the window rendering him blind to what lay behind? Caldwell did not know. He would never know. 15 minutes after the German left, Caldwell slowly, carefully shifted his weight. The numbness in his leg had progressed to a dangerous level. He needed to restore circulation before it became a liability. He moved in increments, millimeters at a time, flexing his toes inside his boots, engaging the muscles in his calf. The pain was sharp and immediate, 1,000 needles driving into his flesh. He welcomed it. Pain meant blood flow. Pain meant function. Klein was watching him, waiting for permission. Caldwell gave a small nod. Klein began to move as well, slow and controlled, shifting his own numb limbs back to life. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The mission was not over. They still needed to observe, to record, to report. But the dynamic had changed. The farmhouse was no longer secure. The German had been inside. Others might follow. Caldwell glanced at the window, at the tree line beyond. The light was better now, the gray dawn giving way to a pale, colorless morning. He could see the terrain more clearly, the snow-covered fields, the dark smudge of trees, the faint line of a road cutting through the landscape. Movement caught his eye. A vehicle, distant, moving south along the road. He focused on it through his scope. It was a German truck, canvas-covered, traveling alone. It passed out of sight behind the trees. Caldwell noted the time, the direction, the type of vehicle. Klein made a small mark in his notebook. Around 0700 they heard voices again. These were closer, maybe 100 yards to the east. A German patrol moving through the trees, calling to one another. Caldwell counted the voices. 4, maybe 5. They were not moving toward the farmhouse. They were parallel to it, heading south. One of the voices called out a name. Another responded. The exchange was brief, functional. The patrol moved on, and the voices faded. Caldwell felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. He had been awake for over 24 hours. His body ached. His mind was sharp, adrenaline and discipline keeping him focused, but he knew the edge was wearing thin. Klein looked worse. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red. They needed to exfiltrate soon, before exhaustion made them careless. But they also needed to confirm the intelligence. Command had sent them here for a reason. The route was active. The Germans were using it. That information was valuable, perhaps valuable enough to justify the risk they had taken. Caldwell made a decision. They would stay for one more hour, observe one more cycle of movement, and then they would pull back. He signaled Klein, who nodded in understanding. The hour passed slowly. They saw two more patrols, heard the distant sound of engines, noted the timing and direction. The pattern was clear. The Germans were moving supplies and personnel south, reinforcing positions deeper in the bulge. The intelligence was solid. At 0800, Caldwell signaled Klein. It was time to leave. They began the process of packing up, slow and methodical, erasing any sign of their presence. They buried the sandbags, scattered debris over their firing position, and checked the room for anything they might have left behind. Then they moved to the staircase, descending one step at a time, pausing to listen at each interval. The lower floor was empty. The door the German had used hung slightly ajar, moving in the wind. Caldwell pushed it open and stepped outside into the frozen morning. The cold hit him immediately, sharper now that he was moving. Klein followed. They moved away from the farmhouse at a crouch, staying low, using the terrain for cover. Behind them, the ruined building stood silent and empty, holding the secret of what had happened inside. What they carried back. The forest was quiet. Caldwell and Klein moved through it with practiced efficiency, navigating by landmarks and memory rather than map. The trees were bare, skeletal against the overcast sky, and the snow beneath their boots was deep enough to muffle sound, but not deep enough to slow them significantly. They moved in a staggered pattern, Caldwell leading, Klein following 10 yards behind, both of them scanning constantly for threats. The German lines were fluid here, shifting with the momentum of the offensive, and there were no clear boundaries. You could walk into an enemy patrol without warning, and survival depended on awareness and luck in equal measure. Caldwell's mind replayed the encounter in the farmhouse over and over, analyzing it from every angle. The German soldier had been young, exhausted, alone. He had sat 6 feet away, his back exposed, vulnerable. Caldwell could have killed him. The shot would have been easy, but it would have accomplished nothing except to announce their presence and compromise the mission. The decision to remain silent had been tactical, rational, correct. And yet, Caldwell could not shake the image of the soldier's face, the way he had stared at whatever he held in his hands, the way his shoulders had sagged with exhaustion. That soldier was someone's son, someone's brother. He had a life before the war, a life that would either continue or end depending on circumstances neither of them could control. Caldwell did not regret sparing him. He simply carried the weight of knowing that he had. They reached the edge of the forest around 0930 and paused to observe the clearing beyond. It was 100 yards of open ground exposed, leading to a ridgeline where American positions were dug in. Caldwell scanned the ridgeline through his scope, looking for the recognition signals they had arranged before the mission. He saw movement, a figure standing near a foxhole, waving a piece of white cloth in a specific pattern. Recognition confirmed. Caldwell signaled Klein, and they moved across the clearing at a run, their breath steaming, their boots pounding through the snow. Rifle barrels tracked them from the ridgeline, then lowered as they drew closer. They climbed the slope and dropped into the trench line, where a lieutenant was waiting. The lieutenant was young, maybe 23, with a thin face and tired eyes. He looked at Caldwell and Klein, taking in their condition, the frost on their uniforms, the exhaustion in their movements. He did not ask if the mission had been successful. He simply waited. Caldwell pulled the notebook from Klein's jacket and handed it over. The lieutenant flipped through it, scanning the entries, nodding slowly. "Good work," he said. "Get some rest. I'll forward this to S2. That was all. No debrief, no questions, no acknowledgement of the 16 hours they had spent lying motionless in a frozen ruin. The intelligence would be logged, analyzed, and incorporated into the larger picture. It would inform decisions made by men who would never know Caldwell's name. That was how it worked. Caldwell and Klein moved down the trench line to a dugout where hot coffee was being distributed. They took tin cups and drank in silence, letting the warmth seep into their hands, their chests, their cores. Around them, other soldiers huddled in foxholes and shelters, preparing for whatever came next. The war continued. It did not pause for exhaustion or cold, or the small quiet moments that determined whether men lived or died. Klein finally spoke, his voice low. "You think he saw us?" Caldwell considered the question. He thought about the way the Germans' eyes had swept over their position, the brief moment of contact that might have been recognition, or might have been nothing. "I don't know," Caldwell said. "Does it matter?" Klein shook his head. "No, I guess it doesn't." They finished their coffee in silence. Later that day, Caldwell wrote a brief entry in his field journal. He noted the coordinates of the farmhouse, the times and directions of German movement, the confirmation of the supply route. He did not mention the German soldier. There was no operational reason to include it. That night, lying in a foxhole wrapped in a blanket that was not warm enough, Caldwell thought about the war and what it required. It required killing, yes, but it also required restraint. It required knowing when to shoot and when to wait. It required carrying the weight of decisions that could not be undone. He thought about the soldier in the farmhouse, wondered if he had made it back to his unit, wondered if he would survive the war. He would never know. The war did not provide those answers. It only provided the next mission, the next objective, the next moment where survival depended on patience and discipline, and the ability to remain still when everything inside you wanted to move. Caldwell closed his eyes and slept.